In January 1920, one of the most humiliating public mockeries in the history of modern science took place. The New York Times, that venerable institution of American journalism, published an editorial that would echo through the decades like a slap across the face of scientific progress. The target was Robert Goddard, a physics professor at Clark University in Massachusetts, who had just published a treatise suggesting that rockets could function in the vacuum of space and might even reach the moon. The Times didn't simply disagree. They eviscerated him. The editorial declared that Professor Goddard, with his academic chair and the backing of the Smithsonian Institution, apparently did not know the relation of action to reaction and clearly lacked the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. The implication was devastating. Here was a physicist, a professor, someone who should understand basic science, proposing something so obviously impossible that even a high school student should know better. Rockets needed something to push against, the editors confidently explained. In the vacuum of space, there would be nothing. The rocket would simply sit there, motionless, defeated by the fundamental laws of physics. What the editors didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined as they smugly penned their ridicule, was that halfway around the world, a handful of German engineers were reading Goddard's work with intense interest. Not to mock it, to steal from it. By 1920, Germany was a nation in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles, signed just 1 year earlier, had stripped away German territory, dismantled its military, and imposed crippling reparations that would bleed the economy for decades. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men. Heavy artillery was forbidden. Long-range weapons of any kind were prohibited. The victorious Allies had every intention of ensuring that Germany would never again threaten European peace. But within the restrictions of Versailles lay a curious loophole. The treaty said nothing about rockets. After all, why would it? In 1919, rockets were little more than fireworks, crude devices that shot up into the sky on holidays and exploded in colored sparks. No military planner took them seriously. No strategic thinker considered them weapons of war. They were toys, spectacles, novelties for celebrations. The German army saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. In 1929, just as the New York Times was ridiculing Goddard into professional obscurity, the German army quietly established a rocket research program. The goal was simple and audacious. If heavy artillery was forbidden, then Germany would develop something entirely new, something the treaty writers had never considered, something that flew through the air on pillars of fire and could strike targets hundreds of miles away. By 1931, the German Army Board of Ordnance had established an official rocket development group. They weren't starting from nothing. In Germany, rocket enthusiasm had been building throughout the 1920s, inspired largely by Hermann Oberth's book, published in 1923, titled The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. Amateur rocket clubs sprang up across the country. Young engineers, dreamers, and scientists gathered at places like the Raketenflugplatz, the rocket flight field outside Berlin, to launch crude experimental rockets and debate the future of space travel. One of these enthusiasts was a young man named Wernher von Braun. Born in 1912 into Prussian aristocracy, von Braun had been fascinated by rockets since his teenage years. In 1930, at the age of 18, he enrolled at the Technische Hochschule in Berlin to study engineering. There he assisted Oberth in liquid-fueled rocket motor tests. For von Braun, rockets weren't weapons. They were vehicles to the stars, the means by which humanity would finally escape the bonds of Earth and explore the cosmos. But von Braun understood something that more idealistic rocket enthusiasts did not. Rocket research required money, facilities, skilled technicians, precision equipment, and time, all of which required a patron, all of which required compromise. When Captain Walter Dornberger of the German Army approached members of the amateur rocket societies in 1932, many refused. They didn't want to develop weapons. They didn't want military secrecy restricting their work. They didn't want their dreams of spaceflight corrupted by the machinery of war. Von Braun had no such qualms. His aristocratic, conservative upbringing had instilled in him a pragmatic worldview. Working for the military wasn't corruption. It was opportunity. It was the price of progress. And so, on December 1st, 1932, Von Braun went to work for the German army. He would develop rockets. Whether they went to the stars or to enemy cities was, for now, beside the point. By 1934, von Braun had earned his doctorate. His thesis, titled Construction, Theoretical, and Experimental Solution to the Problem of the Liquid Propellant Rocket, detailed the design of the A-2 rocket. The German army classified it immediately. It would remain secret until 1960. By the end of 1934, von Braun's team had successfully launched 2 liquid fuel rockets that reached heights of 2.2 and 3.5 kilometers. These were modest achievements by later standards, but they represented something profound. Goddard, working alone in the deserts of New Mexico with minimal funding and constant ridicule, had proven that liquid fuel rockets could fly. The Germans, with military backing, full laboratory facilities, and teams of engineers, were turning those principles into weapons. And the entire time, before 1939, German scientists occasionally contacted Goddard directly with technical questions. They were polite. They were curious. They asked about guidance systems, about fuel mixtures, about the mathematics of thrust and trajectory. Goddard, the man the New York Times had humiliated, the professor whose work was dismissed by his own countrymen, answered them. He had no idea he was teaching his future enemies how to build the weapon that would terrorize London. By 1937, the German rocket program had outgrown its facilities at Kummersdorf, the artillery range where von Braun had conducted his early experiments. The army needed something larger, more isolated, somewhere they could test rockets with ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers rather than mere miles. They chose Peenemünde, a remote stretch of coastline on the Baltic Sea. Construction began that year. By the time the facility opened in May 1937, it was the most advanced rocket research center in the world. Nothing like it existed in America. Nothing like it existed in Britain. The Soviet Union was developing rockets, but their program was years behind. Germany, the defeated nation, the country whose military had been dismantled by treaty, now possessed the most sophisticated rocket technology on Earth. The rocket they were developing was designated the A-4. It would eventually be renamed the V-2, the Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2. But in those early years at Peenemünde, it was simply a technical challenge, a problem to be solved through engineering and mathematics. How do you build a rocket that can carry a 1-ton warhead 200 miles? How do you guide it so it strikes the target? How do you produce it in sufficient quantities to make a military impact? These were questions that consumed thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians. The A-4 project was massive, expensive, and plagued with failures. Adolf Hitler, for his part, was initially skeptical. In March 1943, Munitions Minister Albert Speer arrived at Peenemünde with disturbing news. Hitler had dreamed that no A-4 rocket would ever reach England. In the superstitious, paranoid world of Nazi leadership, dreams mattered. Dreams were omens. Dreams could justify canceling entire weapons programs. Von Braun and Dornberger realized they were in danger. If Hitler lost interest, if he decided the rockets were a waste of resources, everything would end. The laboratories would close. The test stands would fall silent. Years of work would evaporate. So they decided to appeal directly to the Führer. In July 1943, Hitler visited Peenemünde. Von Braun and Dornberger gave him a presentation. They showed him films of successful launches. They explained the rocket's capabilities. They emphasized its invulnerability. Unlike bombers, the V-2 couldn't be shot down. Unlike artillery shells, it couldn't be intercepted. It would strike without warning, traveling faster than sound, giving no time for air raid sirens or shelters. Hitler, who had been indifferent, suddenly became enthusiastic. He promoted Dornberger and awarded von Braun the Iron Cross. The dream was forgotten. The V-2 project was saved. But saving the project and deploying the weapon were two different challenges. The V-2 was technically sophisticated, which meant it was difficult to manufacture. Each rocket required precision engineering, specialized components, and materials that were increasingly scarce as the war turned against Germany. Production was moved to an underground factory called Mittelwerk, carved into the Harz Mountains. Workers at Mittelwerk weren't volunteers. They were concentration camp prisoners, slaves of the Third Reich, worked to death in brutal conditions. At least 10,000 died building the rockets. More people died manufacturing the V-2 than would die from its attacks. On October 3, 1942, the A-4 achieved its first completely successful test flight. The rocket rose from the launch pad at Piedmont, accelerated through the atmosphere, and reached an altitude of 50 miles before arcing downward and striking the target area 120 miles away. It was a milestone in human achievement and a harbinger of terror. That day, Dornberger declared that this was the first day of a new era in transportation, the era of space travel. He wasn't entirely wrong. The V-2 would indeed be the ancestor of the rockets that carried humans to the moon. But first, it would rain death on European cities. The first operational V-2 was launched on September 7, 1944. 2 rockets were fired at Paris, which the Allies had liberated just weeks earlier. Both crashed shortly after launch. On September 8th, another rocket was launched at Paris. This one struck near Port d'Italy, causing modest damage. Later that same day, at 6:43 in the evening, a V-2 was launched from The Hague in occupied Holland, targeting London. It struck Chiswick, a suburb about 6 miles west of central London, at Staveley Road. Robert Stubbs, the 64-year-old caretaker of the local school, was walking across the playing field when the rocket hit. He and 2 others were killed instantly. The age of ballistic missile warfare had begun. The British government, terrified of spreading panic, initially attempted to conceal the attacks. They blamed the explosions on defective gas mains. The public wasn't fooled. People began sardonically calling the V-2s flying gas pipes. By October, the bombardment was sustained. Rockets fell on London day and night, without warning, without sound, just sudden obliterating explosions that left craters 20 meters wide and 8 meters deep. On November 25, 1944, a V-2 struck a crowded Woolworth department store in New Cross at 12:26 in the afternoon. It was a busy shopping Saturday. The explosion killed 168 people instantly, including 33 children. Another 123 were seriously injured. Streets were ankle-deep in blood and glass. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 1,400 V-2 rockets struck Britain, 517 of them hitting London directly. Nearly 3,000 British civilians were killed. Another 6,500 were injured. Antwerp, the crucial Belgian port through which Allied supplies flowed, was hit by more than 1,600 V-2s. On December 16, 1944, a rocket struck the Cine Rex cinema in Antwerp during a showing, killing 567 people in the single deadliest V-2 attack of the war. The weapon that German scientists had developed, the weapon born from American research that Americans had ridiculed, was now slaughtering Allied soldiers and civilians by the thousands. And there was no defense. The V-2 traveled at more than 3,500 miles per hour, faster than sound itself. By the time you heard the explosion, you were already dead or you had survived. Fighter planes couldn't intercept it. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't shoot it down. British intelligence tried psychological warfare, leaking false information suggesting the rockets were overshooting London by 10 to 20 miles. German engineers, trusting the intelligence, recalibrated their guidance systems. The tactic worked. More than half the V-2s aimed at London fell short, exploding harmlessly in the Kent countryside. But hundreds still struck their targets. As the Allies advanced through Europe in early 1945, the race to capture German rocket technology intensified. The Americans, British, Soviets, and French all wanted the rockets, the scientists who built them, and the documentation that explained how they worked. American intelligence had compiled a list of high-priority targets, scientists and engineers, to be captured and interrogated immediately. At the top of that list was Wernher von Braun. By April 1945, with Soviet forces closing in from the east and American forces advancing from west, von Braun faced a choice. He could stay at Piedmont and wait for the Soviets. He could follow SS orders to defend the facility or relocate to some ill-defined fallback position, or he could flee south and surrender to the Americans. Von Braun knew the SS might simply execute him and his team to prevent their capture. He knew the Soviets would likely send him to a labor camp or a gulag. The Americans, he calculated, would want what he knew. So von Braun and his core team disappeared into the Bavarian countryside. They buried documents, hid equipment, and waited. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's brother Magnus approached an American private from the 44th Infantry Division. Speaking in broken English, he explained that they were rocket scientists who wanted to surrender. The Americans, initially skeptical, soon realized what they had captured. Within days, von Braun and more than 100 of his key personnel were in American custody. Major Robert Staver, chief of the Jet Propulsion Section of U.S. Army Ordnance, personally oversaw the operation. Before the Soviets could arrive to take control of the region under the agreed occupation zones, American forces evacuated von Braun's team, along with 300 railcar loads of V-2 rockets and components. They shipped everything to the United States. This was Operation Paperclip, one of the most controversial programs in American history. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States. Many had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had been members of the SS. A few had participated in or overseen atrocities, including the slave labor that built the V-2s. American intelligence officers sanitized their records, expunging references to war crimes, whitewashing their Nazi affiliations, and presenting them as apolitical scientists whose expertise was too valuable to lose. The justification was simple. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. And in the emerging Cold War, that was an argument that trumped ethical considerations. Von Braun and his team were initially stationed at Fort Bliss in Texas, where they worked alongside American engineers to test captured V-2 rockets. By 1950, they were transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, which became the heart of the Army's ballistic missile program. Von Braun thrived in America. He became a naturalized citizen in 1955. He appeared on television, most famously in Walt Disney's 1955 special Man in the Moon, where he explained, with charm and authority, how America would reach the moon. He never mentioned Piemont. He never mentioned the slaves who died building his rockets. He never mentioned the thousands who died when those rockets struck London and Antwerp. He spoke only of the future, of the promise of space exploration, of humanity's destiny among the stars. By 1958, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, triggering panic in America. Suddenly, rocket science was a national priority. Von Braun's team, German engineers working in Alabama, launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, in January 1958 using a modified Redstone rocket. The rocket that carried Explorer 1 into orbit was a direct descendant of the V-2. The fuel systems, the guidance mechanisms, the engine design, all of it traced back to the work done at Piemont. In 1960, von Braun's division was transferred from the Army to the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he oversaw development of the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built. On July 16, 1969, a Saturn V lifted off from Kennedy Space Center carrying Apollo 11 and 3 astronauts toward the moon. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. The rocket that took them was designed by Wernher von Braun, the man who had once built weapons of terror for Adolf Hitler. The technology that carried Americans to the moon was born in Nazi Germany, refined in underground factories built by slaves, tested at a remote Baltic coast facility, and deployed to kill thousands of Allied civilians. And now it was the symbol of American technological triumph. On July 17, 1969, the day after Apollo 11 launched, the New York Times published a brief correction. It referenced their January 13, 1920 editorial mocking Robert Goddard. The correction acknowledged that further investigation and experimentation had confirmed Isaac Newton's findings from the 17th century. It was now definitely established, the Times admitted, that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in an atmosphere. The Times regretted the error. 49 years late, the man they had humiliated had died in 1945, never seeing vindication, never receiving recognition from his own country, never knowing that German scientists had stolen his research to build the weapon that devastated London. When German rocket experts were brought to America after the war and questioned about their work, many expressed amazement. They asked American officials why they didn't simply consult Goddard, from whom they had learned virtually everything they knew. Von Braun himself later said, "Don't you know about your own rocket pioneer? Dr. Goddard was ahead of us all." But Goddard had worked in obscurity, ridiculed by the press, ignored by the military, funded with a pittance from the Smithsonian and later the Guggenheim Foundation. His highest flying rocket reached about 9,000 feet. His work was methodical, careful, and underfunded. Meanwhile, German engineers with unlimited military backing, teams of scientists, and state-of-the-art facilities had taken his principles and built a weapon that reached the edge of space. By the time Goddard died of throat cancer on August 10, 1945, just days before Japan surrendered, German rockets were already being tested in New Mexico. The weapon he had envisioned, the technology he had pioneered, the physics he had proven, had all been appropriated by the enemy, used to slaughter thousands, and then captured by his own country, which had never believed in him. In 1959, NASA established the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, in his honor. It was a belated recognition, a posthumous apology, an attempt to correct history. But Goddard never saw it. He died believing his life's work had been wasted, that the press had destroyed his reputation, that his own government had considered his research worthless. The irony is almost unbearable. American journalists declared rockets impossible. German scientists built them anyway, using American research. Those rockets killed thousands of Allied civilians. America then seized the German scientists, brought them to the United States, gave them citizenship, and made them heroes of the space program. The V-2, which had been designed to destroy London, became the foundation of the Saturn V, which carried Americans to the moon. Wernher von Braun, who oversaw rocket production using concentration camp labor, became a celebrated NASA director and the public face of American space exploration. Robert Goddard, the American pioneer who proved rockets could work, died in obscurity. When you consider the entire arc of the story, from the New York Times editorial in 1920 to the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, you're left with questions about credit, morality, and legacy. Who deserves recognition for space exploration? The American scientist who proved it was possible but was mocked and ignored? The German engineers who turned theory into weapons of mass destruction? The American government that forgave Nazi affiliations in exchange for technical expertise? The slaves who died building the rockets that became the foundation of spaceflight? The V-2 killed approximately 9,000 people during the war, most of them civilians. At least 10,000 more died manufacturing it in the underground metalwork factory. That's 19,000 deaths directly attributable to a single weapon system. And that weapon system, refined and improved, became the basis for every liquid fuel rocket launch since. The Saturn V that carried Apollo astronauts, the Titan II that launched Gemini missions, the Delta and Atlas rockets that put satellites into orbit, the Redstone that carried America's first astronaut into space. All of them trace their lineage to Piemont, to the V-2, to the work done by engineers serving Adolf Hitler. The moral calculus is complicated. Von Braun later claimed he was only interested in space exploration, that he viewed the military application as a necessary evil, a means to fund his true passion. He said they felt no moral scruples about the possible future use of their brainchild because they were interested solely in exploring space. But this explanation rings hollow. Von Braun visited Middlework. He saw the conditions. He knew slaves were dying to build his rockets. He knew those rockets were being launched at civilian populations. And he continued his work. He didn't sabotage the weapons. He didn't slow production. He didn't resign. He made the rockets better, more accurate, more reliable. Thousands died because his rockets worked. And yet, when the war ended, America wanted what he knew. Operation Paperclip was justified on national security grounds. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. And this argument, in the context of the emerging Cold War, carried weight. The Soviet Union did capture German scientists. They did seize V-2 technology. They did develop their own rocket program based on German research. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, it was a rocket derived from the V-2. When they put Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961, the R-7 rocket that carried him was a direct descendant of German missile technology. The space race was, in many ways, a competition between German engineers working for different superpowers. The uncomfortable truth is this: the same technology that killed thousands in London and Antwerp enabled humanity's greatest exploration achievement. The same engineers who served the Third Reich designed the rockets that expanded human knowledge and capability beyond Earth. The same mathematical principles that guided missiles toward civilian targets guided spacecraft toward the moon. There is no separating these realities. They are bound together, inseparable, a reminder that technology is morally neutral and that human achievement often rises from the darkest circumstances. Robert Goddard never received this kind of moral scrutiny because he never had the opportunity to apply his work at scale. Had he been given military funding in the 1920s or 1930s, had the American government taken his research seriously, it's entirely possible American rockets would have been bombing Berlin by 1943. The difference between Goddard and von Braun isn't necessarily one of character or morality. It's one of circumstance. Goddard was ignored. Von Braun was embraced by the Nazi war machine. One worked in obscurity, while the other worked with unlimited resources. One died unknown while the other became famous. By the 1970s, investigators and journalists began examining Operation Paperclip more critically, uncovering the whitewashed records and documenting the war crimes of some participants. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen rocket production at Middlework, where thousands of slaves died, had helped develop the Saturn V in America. He was eventually forced to renounce his citizenship and leave the United States in 1984 to avoid prosecution. George Rick Hay, who managed the acquisition of enslaved workers at Middlework, was extradited to West Germany in 1947 on war crime charges, though he was later acquitted. These cases reveal the moral compromises inherent in Operation Paperclip, the deliberate decision to value technical expertise over justice. And what of Goddard's legacy? In 1960, his widow Esther successfully sued the U.S. government for patent infringement, arguing that military rockets developed after the war used Goddard's designs without compensation. She was awarded $1 million. It was vindication of sorts, proof that Goddard's work had been foundational. NASA named their first space research laboratory after him. Craters on the moon and Mars bear his name. He is remembered as the father of American rocketry. But these are posthumous honors, recognition that came too late for the man who endured years of ridicule and died believing his work had failed. The story of German rocket development, American dismissal, and eventual American appropriation is fundamentally a story about ego, about the arrogance of those who declare impossibility without evidence, and the determination of those who prove them wrong. The New York Times declared rockets couldn't work in a vacuum. Robert Goddard proved they could. German scientists took his work and built weapons. America took the German scientists and built a space program. And in the end, a rocket designed by a former Nazi carried Americans to the moon, while the pioneer, who made it all possible, lay forgotten in a cemetery in Massachusetts. The entire episode demonstrates how history refuses simple narratives. We want heroes and villains, but we get complicated humans making choices in difficult circumstances. We want technological progress to be clean and noble, but it emerges from war, suffering, and compromise. We want to celebrate achievement without acknowledging its cost, but the cost is always there, written in the names of the dead, the slaves who built the rockets, the civilians who died when they fell, the scientists whose work was stolen, the moral compromises that enabled progress. What do you think of the legacy of rocket development in World War II? Should we celebrate the space program while acknowledging its roots in Nazi weapons of terror? Or does the achievement of space exploration transcend its dark origins? Was Operation Paperclip a pragmatic necessity of the Cold War or an unconscionable decision to forgive war crimes in exchange for technical advantage? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.